All right, welcome. We are going to talk about ASP.NET Core Razor pages today. How many of you were in my session yesterday on building APIs using ASP.NET Core? A few of you, okay. So some of the content, guess what, is exactly the same because the foundation is the same. So I moved that to the end, right? So the stuff that is going to be repeated is at the end of the session. So we're going to dive right into the front end. But anyway, so who am I? My name's Phil. I'm the CTO and Chief Architect for Pinterest Mullins. We're a personal injury firm nationwide. I've written a bunch of books. I speak at a lot of conferences. Well, I speak at all the VS Lives and then run the user group back home. The only thing I want to call out is in July every year, in December every year, I give a 4-day hands-on workshop through VS Live. You can just find it at vslive.com. We got a deep discount and registration right now. It is hands-on. It's full stack development and GitHub Copilot. So what we do is we build a series of applications. We start with Entity Framework Core, and we build a data access library. We build an MVC site. We build a Razor Pages site. We build an API, and we build a Blazor WASM app. And that's all in 4 days. We also heavily use Copilot. If you don't have Copilot, you can still do all the workshop anyway. vslive.com. Save $200 if you register by June 19th. And like I said, it's everything.net. So before we get into specifics, let's talk about migration. How many of you are still on Framework? So review, okay. So the good news is if you're an MVC or Web API in Framework, it's not horrible because MVC and RESTful services are fully supported in ASP.NET Core. A lot of times it is clipboard inheritance, file a new project, create a new API, or create a new MVC project, and clipboard inheritance of your controllers. A lot of the code will just work. Obviously, you need to make a bunch of changes. How many of you are in web forms? Yeah, sorry about your luck. That's where my life is. Our case management app is in web forms. There is this thing called YARP, yet another reverse proxy. I don't know much about it. The few demos I've seen have not wowed me. And conceptually, I have concerns. The way it works is you build a ASP.NET Core application that then has a reverse proxy into your web forms application. And magically, as you upgrade web forms to ASP.NET Core, it just works. That just makes me nervous. Haven't dug into it. Here's what we are doing. So there's two main things. Well, okay, there's 3 things you can do. 3 things is never upgrade your app. You laugh, but it's a viable option, right? If the app is working, it's internal and you don't care about performance and things like that, there's .NET 4.8 is not going away as long as Windows is around. Right, so as long as Windows exists, there'll be .NET Framework, which means you'll always have support for web forms. So if this app isn't vital, even if it is vital and it works, I just maintain it. But typically, if it's in web forms, it's so old that the business logic isn't right, the screens aren't right, it's not performing, things like that. Our intake app was that way. We rebuilt it in .NET Core from the ground up, redesigning as we go, right? And 3 years later, we had ta-da development. You know what that is? You go away for a little bit and you go, ta-da, right? And here's an app. Because we couldn't replace the existing until we had at least feature parity in the new one. It took us 3 years for not that complex. Okay, it's a very complex app, but not a very big app. And I realized that that's not a viable way forward because we stopped any improvements of the web forms while we're building the new stuff. So what we're doing now with web forms is we are internally within .NET Framework 4.8, we're taking those web form pages and moving them to MVC5 pages. Because MVC5 web forms and web API all happily coexist in the same project. And then when we get everything moved over to MVC5, we'll move it to core at that point. Right. What Microsoft is recommending right now is if you're in a web forms world, you should move to Blazor. Blazor server-side, with server-side rendering. That's still not magical. I know they're working on some tooling around that. But here's the thing, right? If the app is bad and wrong, and you have a magic tool upgrade it to Blazor, it's still bad and wrong, just in Blazor, right? So I think there's a little more thought that needs to go into that. Anyway, that's just about web forms. We're going to talk about Razor pages. So let's get just a fundamental slide up here. One of the big advantages with the new ASP.NET Core is that it is one framework. There's just one ASP.NET Core. And in framework, in .NET framework, okay, let me get this straight. I still call .NET Core .NET Core, because if I just say .NET, you're going to be very easy talking about .NET Core. You're talking about .NET Framework. So I just call it .NET Core. So let's get that out of the way. But .NET Core and ASP.NET Core, which is built on top of .NET Core, obviously it's all cross-platform, et cetera, et cetera. But the real big advantage, one of the real big advantages is there's just one ASP.NET Core. And building RESTful services, building MVC web applications, Razor page applications, Blazor, it's all the same framework, right? So we don't have to make these decisions like we did in framework of, well, is it a controller? Is it an async controller? Is it web matrix? Whatever. So it's just one, obviously cross-platform and lightning fast. So ASP.NET Core continues to win the benchmark competitions. We all know that when they submit things, and not just Microsoft, anybody submits to the benchmark applications, they have written code for the benchmarks, which is probably not how you write code. It's not how I write code, but it is lightning fast, built on top of a open source web server called Kestrel. That's how ASP.NET Core web applications get rendered. Kestrel is based on libuv, and it has some security bolted into it, but still my recommendation is your edge server, the one that's exposed to the world, should be something that is battle hardened, right? IIS, Nginx, Apache, one of those. And what happens when you deploy, for example, if you deploy your Razor Pages application into Azure App Services, it is still rendering in Kestrel. There's a reverse proxy to IIS, and it's just magic. It just works. All right, what is a Razor page? Let me get into something that actually has some meat to it. Okay, how many of you used MVC? Pretty much all of you, okay? So MVC is controller specific or controller focused. In other words, I have a controller and hopefully it's, cars controller, following single responsibility. It has all these methods about cars, right? Add, remove, get, things like that, right? So your controller is the focal point. And you can have multiple views. You can have action methods that return different views, things like that. And I like it. It works great. But sometimes I want an application framework that is page-centric. Right? Let's say that I'm building marketing type stuff or very simple forms over data, and I don't need all of the infrastructure of what MVC brings to bear. I just want to say, hey, here's a page, here's some code behind it. Right? Here's a page, here's some code behind it. Oh, it has a view. And that's where Razor Pages really shines. So instead of controller, like we have in an MVC application, we have what's called the page model. And that is the base class for all Razor Pages. And what the page model brings us, it's the same thing that controller and controller base brings us in MVC applications. Page model has all of the non-UI stuff, like helper methods, like I can return OK, right? Here, return the page. I could do return not found result, right? So that's going to be an action result that is a 404. So I got all these helper methods in the bottom. And then on top of that, I've got the UI helper methods, returning pages and returning views. Wait a minute. Views, that's model view controller. No, so what you see is, and this is really nice, Razor Pages is built essentially on top of MVC. So we get all the same constructs. We get a layout, right? We get partial views. We get view components. We get tag helpers. We get all these things we have in MVC. The only real difference between the two is in MVC. Okay, there's some slight or other differences, but let's just high level. In MVC, I have a controller that I navigate to that returns a view, where in Razor Pages, I have pages. And and then there's some nicety built into that. All right. So we have this page model, right? So this page is just a very silly page, validation. And then we have the view and the code behind. And the view is .cshtml. It's a C# HTML page. That's the view. And then we have .C# HTML or C# HTML.cs. Easy for me to say. That is the code behind. And you might be thinking, ooh, code behind. We hate code behind, right? That's an anti-pattern. That's evil. It's not really. Because think of the controller action methods. You have code in there. But to have clean code, your code behind should just do the stuff that the view needs and then should shell out to some sort of service. Think of the person working the drive-through window or the ordering counter at a Starbucks, right? There's people working behind that person. Let's just take the drive-through window. You pull up the drive-through window, it's a view, right? It's a page. And you talk into that. You give it input. You respond to the controls on the page. That then gets submitted as a request to the page model, right, through the route. And this code executes on get or on post. Now, we could have the person who's working the drive-through window then go make the coffee and make the food and do this and work the cash register, but that would be highly inefficient. We would all admit that, right? So it's much better to have your on get or on post than say, hey, coffee person, make the coffee. Hey, food person, make the food. Hey, cash register person, get the money. And that's how we should build our applications anyway, whether it's MVC or Razor Pages or Blazor. Right? Our page model has a method on get or on post where the request is coming in, and then it hands it off to a service. This allows you to reuse that code across multiple pages. Right? Now, if you want to dump all of your code into code behind, I'm going to be right there with you saying code behinds are evil. But they're really not. The problem is it's just a little too easy sometimes to make them bad. Another big difference between MVC and Razor Pages, and I mentioned it highly, but let's go deeper into it, is routing. So in MVC, we just define the route. We tell it whatever we want the route to be, right? It's this literal, it's this token, et cetera, et cetera. Razor Pages by default is routing based on file structure. So we have a pages folder, and I zoomed in over there. I meant to zoom in over here. Right, and so I have pages, cars, and under there, pages, cars, create, delete, details, edit, index. So the way we navigate in Razor Pages by default is we would go, mysite.com/cars/details. It looks the same as if I was on an MVC site, right? Because I'd have a controller called cars and an action method called details. So what's the route, right? Cars, details, looks the same. The difference is that with the controllers, we can say, I don't want it to be cars, I want it to be foo, right? Where you can do that in Razor Pages, it's highly not recommended. Why is it different? Because it's page-centric. That was the whole goal. But remember, it's built on top of MVC, so there's nothing wrong, and we do this quite a bit, where we'll have a lot of our applications written with MVC controllers and views, and then we'll have pages in there also for like the contact us and about and the legal stuff and those types of things. So you can blend them. They work very well together. But again, the whole purpose of the framework is to be page centric. There was a movement in Microsoft to simplify is not the right word. A lot of Microsoft development has ceremony around it, and some might argue that MVC has a lot of ceremony because I have to set up a controller and I have to have an action method and I have to have this folder with views and make the views. Whereas Razor Pages, I'd right click, add page, I have a page. And they're kind of interchangeable, but they're kind of not, right? Because I think really they both have power, right? And I think it's not either, it's both. Handling requests becomes much simpler in Razor Pages. So in MVC, we've got controller action methods. We have to label with HTTP get, HTTP post, get and post. So all browser can do that. That's all we deal with. In the page model, you just implement on get or on get async and on post or on post async. You can rename them. Typically, it's not suggested that you rename them because then people are like, hey, where's the code that handles this? But there are situations where, for example, I have one page here for my GDPR consent where I have renamed them. They still need on get in it, but I can add in an additional name. So now if you look at the code, when you download it, it'll say, withdraw consent or give consent. And then instead of having to have two different page models for just executing this code, I just have one where I rename it. Oh, and there a nicety about Razor Pages is that anti-forgery is on by default. So there's this concept called anti-forgery tokens that has been around for a long time in MVC. And it just is a way to make sure is really strong. It helps to reduce the risk of some other site posting back to your server. So the way the anti-forgery token works, there's 3 bits to it. There's a cookie, there's a server-side component, and then there's a form component. The way in MVC, you would actually mark it with all of your posts with validate anti-forgery token, right? And with that in place, if somebody tries to post to your method that doesn't have those other components, the cookie and the hidden field in the UI or in the form values, then it just gets rejected. But I think it's a 404 actually is what happens. Well, that doesn't exist here, right? But you had to opt in. You still have to opt in MVC. You have to remember to turn it on. With Razor Pages, it's just on by default. You actually have to go through great hoops to turn it off. So I'm not going to tell you how to turn it off because you shouldn't. Route parameters. Let's look at our edit page. Right, so a Razor page begins with the page directive, right? At page, that's going to be at the top. And then the route parameters follow that. So it's the same token format. So this is taking an optional parameter called ID. This will then map to the backend or the code behind, right? As right here, a nullable int, right? And then here it's taking a non-nullable int on the post. So you can have a view that says, oh, my page directive says it's nullable, but then I can constrict that more so that on a post, if it's a null, that post will never find its way home. That becomes part of the route. Okay, let me explain some of the infrastructure here. This is part of, this project is part of my bigger 4-day thing. And one of the things I do in the 4-day thing is I teach you how you can use a base page model, right, to encapsulate some of that code. And you can. I leave it in here as a teaching mechanism. I'll tell you, we don't do this at work. It seems like a good idea. It's better just to have services. So what you'll see in some of these samples is I have my base page model, which is my base, right? That inherits from page model. And I've got these methods down here to try and encapsulate. One of the things that you want to pay attention to is that having a base control or base page model like this, you still want to have your page model for every page capture the on get and on post. They will trickle through, but my experience has shown that if you don't have an on post and on get in your page model for your page, it gets really hard to debug because it's just thrown through and it's really going away from the whole page centric. So these examples, still page centric, but like here's my edit code, my get one entity. So my get the value, get the lookup values, save, right? All those things are in the base page model. So I have this common collection of code. I'm not repeating myself. So with that in mind, let's talk about the PRG pattern or the post. Yes. On my method, can I decorate it with a verb? No. It's looking for the word on post and it's looking for the word on get. So yes, you can decorate it by naming it properly. Right, yeah, in MVC, you decorate it with the verbs you want to have. This is a naming convention. All right, so the post redirect get pattern is very simple. Anytime somebody is posting to your site and that post is successful, you should redirect to a get. Why do we want to do this? Have you ever been on a browser that said, do not refresh your screen, you're going to get charged twice, right? Or worse, it refreshes, it doesn't tell you, you hit F5 and now you're getting charged twice. Because a browser on a refresh is going to resubmit the exact same way it did before. So if it was a get and you hit F5, it does another get. If it was a post, you hit F5 or click refresh, it does another post. So the PRG pattern is very simple. We want to post. If we successfully post, we redirect to a get. And this is outlined here. So here's my post. It didn't work, so we want to go back to the page. Let them try it again. So here I'm saying return page. Now notice that here I have an action result, and here I don't. So we'll get to that in just a second. But I have to actually return an action result. And a page is an action result, like a view is an action result in MVC. So I return the page, they resubmit. We want them to repost because the values weren't good. So then we call save with one lookup async because I'm really bad at naming things. And if the model state's not valid, right, which means there was a problem in binding, we're going to get the lookup values again because there's a drop down for like manufacturer and which car company it is, and then return the page. Otherwise, we save it. There's no error handling in here. And then we call redirect to page. And in this case, redirect to page is going to do a 301, 302, 30x redirect to a get page. And so now I'm on the details page and they can hit F5 all day long. It just refreshes the details. This took me a little bit to get used to. Let's talk about binding. So in MVC and APIs, the way that you bind to the data coming in is it's a parameter on the post method, right? Because it posts, and then if it's an API, it's reading the JSON body. If it is a MVC site, it's reading the form collection or it's reading, other things coming in. And you signal the binding that you want to happen by having this, entity add to cart view model RP for eraser pages in the on get or on post. And we can still do that. We can do this. We can do that right there. That is completely legitimate, right? This is built upon MVC, so that's legal. But the accepted paradigm, and I like this once I got used to it, is that we have on the page model, remember this is a page framework. So we have a public property on the page model, and this is what we bind to. We have to set bind property as an attribute on it. And I've got my settings so that it would put it on one line. That might be a little easier to read if I do it that way. And so the bind property, when it's a get, it's just going to return the view. And we'll talk about how that works shortly. On a post, it's going to bind to this bind property. The way data binding works is the same way it works everywhere else. It looks at everywhere else in the ASP.NET Core world. It's going to look at this entity class using reflection to get the name value pairs. It's just going to look at the form values getting submitted in, and it's going to try and reconstitute an instance of this object using those name value pairs from the form collection. If everything works great, woohoo, you now have an entity. If there is a problem, and this is the same as in MVC and a web API, let's say that my entity has a date field, right? Date built. And the data coming in, everything comes in as a string, right? That's the way the web works. So the data coming in for the date built field can't be converted to a date, right? It's invalid. Somebody wrote their name in there or just a typo. It doesn't stop the process. What happens is model state is a property on the page model, right? The base class that we're using. And it has a collection, dictionary really, of all the errors that were found. So binding errors get logged in model state. After it's done trying to bind, and the properties that worked will bind, right? It's not an all or nothing proposition. But then it's going to look at any validation issues. So let's say date built was required. It couldn't be bound because it's an invalid date. Now we have two errors on that field because it's null and it's a bad format. So model state gets added to this. That's why we'll have things like, is model state valid? And if everything works, it's valid. If anything is awry, whether it's binding issues itself or the validation rules, then model state's not valid, and then you can have them retry. There's UI stuff that plays into as well. We'll look at that shortly. How many of you have written custom validation attributes? Anyone? Few of you? If you haven't, I think you should strongly look at it. The way custom, but actually not overlap, part of it is, but then we're going to talk about iClient Model Validator. If you find yourself writing validation logic, great. If you find yourself writing that validation logic more than once, you really need to think about how you can encapsulate it. And a great way to encapsulate that logic for server side and client side is using a custom validation attribute. So this must be greater than 0 attribute, inherits from validation attribute, and implements iClient Model Validator. When we look at this, here we have a constructor with a default message string. We override format message string to make sure that we actually get the format in there. We're passing in a name. That just makes it look pretty. And then we have this is valid. Is valid is server-side validation. So you get the value of the thing being validated, right? Because we've decorated different properties on our model to have these validation attributes. So let's say that this is quantity. We get the whole validation context. We get the rest of the thing being validated. And remember, validation happens after binding. So the model is as fully constituted as it's going to be. Pattern matching, if it's not an int, then I return a message. And the way these validation attributes work, if you return anything but a string.empty or validation result.success, it's an error. So you could say, great, it passed, and that's going to get logged as an error. So that's server side. So it gets submitted to the page model, gets in there, server-side validation, it'll fill model state and go back out. And you say, that's great. But you don't want it to get to the page We'd rather it stay client side and not even waste that cycle to the server if the data is not valid. So this is where the add validation method comes in. It comes from the iClient model validator um, interface. And then here's what we do. Now I have tied it into jQuery validation and jQuery validation unobtrusive, and that's pretty common to do it that way. You can tie it into other ones. But this will then add attributes to this thing as it gets rendered. Data val greater than 0, val greater than 0 dash reevaluate. And so when the way that jQuery validation works is data val dash and then the name of a function that will be called to validate that property. So you have to write the JavaScript function. And then that function dash reevaluate true means always reevaluate this property, even if it didn't change, but something else in the model changed. Otherwise, it's only going to reevaluate if you change that particular model. So let's look at this in action. So it's required, that's a built-in validation attribute, must be greater than 0, and I have another one, must be greater than this other field. So I want to check to make sure that this field, quantity, is not greater than stock quantity, and I have it all encapsulated here. So when we look at the page, we go to validation, stock quantity is 2, quantity is 0, must be greater than 0, okay? 5, must not be greater than stock quantity. Let's change stock quantity, and here's why we want to reevaluate, because of course it doesn't want to reevaluate for me. It hates me. I hit save. It doesn't do anything. This form's an empty form. It's just meant to show the validation. Probably actually throwing an exception in the back. But let's look at the view and how we got all these things to show up. So here's our view. It's a page. Here's our model. Now in MVC views, you also specify the model, right? And the model is going to be your car, your person, whatever your thing is. But the model in Eraser page is always the code behind class, not the thing that's the bind entity, right? And that took me a little bit to get used to. I spent so much time doing MVC. So here the model is the validation model, which is the name of the page. So when I'm binding to something, it's the model. Remember, the model for the view is the code behind, so it's actually the entity property. So entity.id, entity.stock quantity, et cetera, If there are any errors, JavaScript errors or server-side errors, all we have to do is ASP-validation-4, and that will show that validation error on the UI. And if there's no validation error, it goes away. We also get this validation summary. And here I'm saying, just show me the model. There's also all. So all says any error that's in there, I'm going to show a summary up here. A model only says if there's a specific problem with the model, but not a particular field. And then none is also an option, which to me is a little weird because why put a validation summary up there if you don't want any validation to show? Okay, there's some constructs in here we're going to talk about in a minute, but let's go to views and layouts. So if we go into pages, shared, layouts. So the way that this works, it's similar to MVC. Anything that's in the shared folder under pages is accessible by anything under the pages folder. You don't have to specify a path or anything. It's kind of like the default zone. So we have this file called layout, starts with an underscore. People say, why the underscore? It's a convention. It has no technical meaning whatsoever. It came from WebMatrix. WebMatrix had a policy that if your view started with an underscore, it could not be rendered directly to the client. Layout cannot be directly rendered to the client. So as a convention, we tend to name partials with an underscore. But again, there's no technical reason for it. So I'd like to create a bunch of partials So here's the head, so the partial. We're going to talk about all these funny purple things in a minute. We go back to our layout, and here's what I want you to look at. Render body. This is the same way MVC works. It's similar to how, conceptually it's the same as how web forms works. Where web forms has a master page, right? And then the pages get rendered in that master page. So this is our layout. Render body is where the page gets rendered. But we can also have sections. And this works the same as in JavaScript. So if we look at, our validation page, we have a section called scripts. And I've got some code in here. And this code requires that jQuery is loaded first, right? That's how JavaScript works. You have to have the library work before you can start calling it. It's sequential. So if I just had all of this in a page and rendered it here, but all my JavaScript files are here at the bottom, right? Style sheets at the top, JavaScript at the bottom, that's a performance thing, then these won't work. So what sections allow us to do is on any of our views, say, all right, put this in a section. And the section is called scripts. We go back to our validation, section scripts. So this will actually take everything in that section tag and put it in that part of the layout. So this is a very powerful construct I don't think people really appreciate so much. It's not just for scripts. You have to do it for your JavaScript. But we have landing pages where we've got phone numbers for local attorneys, right? But it's the same code, same view, but it's data driven. And we have the phone number at the top, and we have the phone number at the bottom, and the phone number in the middle. You know how marketing works. And so instead of having to have this entire view built up, we have sections called phone number 1, phone number 2, phone number 3. And so here's the main page. We've got in the layout, we've got our hero page. That's just a big image, right? And then the phone number, it's a section, phone number 1. And it puts it right there in the top of the page. And so I can decorate it data-driven into all these different places. Sections can be optional or required. In this case, scripts are optional because not every page is going to have JavaScript. But you can also make it required, and then the page will throw an error if it tries to load. Now, let's talk about templates. Templates are also very powerful. I don't think people use them enough. Let's go to car, and you'll see these two folders: display templates, editor templates. I'm getting a lot of explosions with the mic. I apologize for that. Let's look at display templates first. So here's a car, right? It's just a template. It's a way to say, here's how I want to display this stuff anytime, right? I want to use the same template each time. I can have a template with a little different name, cars with colors, and I can do the same thing with editor templates. And then when we leverage these, this is actually really an awesome feature. So we go into details and we say display for entity. The entity is a car. So it's going to look at the display templates folder in the pages folder that I'm in this case cars, or if it can't find it, it'll look in shared for a template named cars, right? It's named after the class. And when it finds it, it renders a display. So this will use this template here to render the page. So every time I'm doing this, here's the details page, delete where I show the car you're about to delete, right? Display for. And same thing with edit. Editor for, and create. Editor for. So with these templates, I can reuse it. There's also system-wide templates or application-wide templates that I use. So for example, shared display templates, here's a date time display template. So anytime a date time is getting rendered in the UI, this template comes into play because it's named date time. So the model's a date time nullable. If it's null, I output the word unknown. So that ampersand colon is the kind of like response.write, if you will. And then if it isn't null, Is it a nullable type? If it's a nullable type, I'm going to get the value and then string that to a short date time. If it's not a nullable type, I don't have to call dot value. I can't call dot value. So I cast it to a date time, non-nullable, and then I output it. So everywhere in the app, I'm going to have a short date string if there's a date, or it'll say the word unknown. I don't have to worry about writing it on every single page. How many of you are using templates like that even in MVC? A few of you are? Okay, I saw a lot of people taking notes, so I was kind of happy that you guys saw that. GDR support, I'm not going to really go deep into it. With ASP.Core 2.1, they provided a template for us. The slides go into great detail about it. I'm just going to show you how it works. So if I revoke the cookie policy, right, you've seen this. Hey, we use headers. You accept it. I accept it. I revoke it. I accept it. I revoke it. So obviously, to fully implement this, you need to talk to your legal department, get them to write the cookie policy, et cetera, et cetera. But I show you how that you can set that up here in the app. And if you don't care about it, then you can just ignore what I just said. All right, tag helpers. Tag helpers are huge. I mean, so I talked about in the beginning, if you had an MVC site in MVC 5, that you could do file new project and then copy and paste stuff over, it would largely work, and it will. But in MVC 5, we had to do, excuse me, HTML helpers. So if I wanted to programmatically define a form or an action link, right, it would be at HTML.action link, and then I have to put a lambda in there and programming stuff. Not complex, but I remember I had a friend of mine, I run this small nonprofit conference back home, and a friend of mine said, I'm going to make your site look pretty because it looks like a developer built it. And I'm like, well, a developer did build it. And she said, give me the source code. And it was an MVC5 site. And I just gave her the HTML. And then she called me and said, I don't know what to do with this. I can't touch it. Because there were no links in there, right? There were no form tags. There were no input tags because they're all at HTML helpers. So one thing that Microsoft created with ASP.Core from the beginning of Core are these things called tag helpers. And tag helpers keep you in the markup. So let's look at probably the best solution, or the best way is this display. Yeah, there's a ton of them on here. See how that's purple? Well, I'm highlighting it, so you can't see it's purple now. Form is purple, ASP page, right? If I did something like class equals foo, then it's not purple. Purple is just with my color codes, that's a tag helper. So when I say form, ASP-page, it is then going to use page routing to give me an IntelliSense to all the pages I can navigate to from here. Typically, you'll get IntelliSense there. This will say, hey, go to the page. This becomes the action method. The other thing that it does for us is, well, no, because we have anti-forgery turned on. In MVC, if you have a form tag helper, it turns on anti-forgery for you. But let me explain what's going on. All these tag helpers are server-side code. So when this thing gets rendered, and remember, all ASP.Core that's server-side rendered is only emitting strings to the browser, right? It's code running on the server and it emits strings. So all of your C#, all of your Razor code is not making it to the browser. And that's why I said server-side Blazor. So what happens is this is going through the processor and it says, oh, ASP page equals edit route ID. The ID for the route is this. It builds that action link programmatically. So the validation summary that runs server side. Hey, what does model state look like? Oh, model state says we have errors. Let me show them. Here's an input. Type equals hidden. ASP-4. Entity ID. Oh, that's numeric. So it's actually going to render an HTML5 compatible tag. It has going to have all of that JavaScript stuff in for that validation in there. It's going to have the HTML5 validation. So it's doing all that processing. This is the same as doing at HTML.input, if you're familiar with that from MVC5, right? But instead of doing that, I'm just in markup. So if I wanted to add a class, I just added a bunch of, I know what's going on. I added a whole bunch of extensions after seeing Mad's talk yesterday, and I think they're fighting each other. So here's my CSS class I want to add. And so now I can give this to Martine and say, hey, make it pretty. And she's like, oh yeah, this is just HTML. I can do that. There's a bunch of these. Let's go into the car template here, right? So here's a label, ASP4. Here's a select. So ASP-items, patch in the items, it'll make us select and it'll have the right one chosen, right? So a lot of these tag helpers. And again, they're all available as at HTML tag helpers also. But there's some that aren't available, and these are very nice. So let's look at these. Environment. Normally I talk about environment and configuration first, but the people who came to my talk yesterday already heard that, so I wanted to flip the order. But there's this concept of what environment is my application running in with ASP.NET Core. And so this is an environmental tag helper. So if the environment is development or local, this is what gets emitted. If it's not development or local, this is what it gets emitted. So as I move my views and my application from development to staging to production, I'm now altering what gets emitted without having to copy, uncomment, recomment, do that, right? The environment is then selecting it for me. So this line will never show in the browser. So this is a tag helper that just disappears, right? It says, oh, if this exclude works, then emit this thing. This is also a tag helper here for a link. So here's a style sheet. Here's where the style sheet's coming from. It's a CDN. And oh, by the way, here's the fallback. If the CDN goes down, use this other file in its place. Well, how does it know it goes down? Well, here's a test class. I'm looking for H6. I'm looking for the property on that class, font weight. I'm looking for a value of 500. So if that works, that's my very simple test to say bootstrap loaded from the CDN, all is good, continue on. If the CDN was down for some reason, or I had the wrong test value, then it'll load from my local disk. So even when a CDN goes down, your app is still showing all of the CSS and JavaScript that normally would not show. We get the same thing with JavaScript. The test is a little simpler, right? There's our source, there's our fallback. And the test is just using JavaScript truthiness. So if window.jQuery passes the truthiness test, in other words, it's not undefined, it's not null, it's not zero, then this passes and all is well. ASP-append-version equals true. What this does, and you can use on any content type file like JavaScript, CSS, images, whatsoever, is it'll create an MD5 hash of the file and append that to the URI. So what gets rendered to the browser is live jQuery, jQuery.js, $v equals, and then an MD5 hash. And why this matters is browsers cache files by the same name. And if you change it, how many times have you had to text support your mom or dad and you had to tell them to hit the control key, and while you're holding the control key, click the refresh button, right? Because the browser had cached it. So this is cache busting. Gets right around it. You can build your own tag helpers. I'm not going to go into great detail about how to do it, but you inherit from tag helper and then you overwrite process, but I'm going to show you the tag helpers I have in the demo. These are all custom tag helpers here. Edit, details, delete. And yes, I could just rewrite that. It's very simple. It's just a link to go to the edit page or the details page. But because they are tag helpers, when I go into my list here, this is what I write, right? Item edit, that's the name of my tag helper. Item ID, that's the property I'm passing in. That's the ID of the current item. And then it's going to go to the edit page. So how does this work? Again, real quick, because there's so much content I could talk about. Here's my item edit tag helper. I like using base classes, so I'm implementing or inheriting from tag helper itself. Then I go, okay, I need to get the endpoint. I'm building the route, right? And then I'd say, okay, make this an anchor tag. The href is going to have this value. The CSS class has this. And then here is the actual text that I want to display. So I could change this to something else like green or blue here in the code, and everywhere I have this edit or details, it'll pick it up. Another tag helper that we use is an ASP-4, right? ASP-label is the copy. That's the ASP, that's the Microsoft version. I think we call it ASP-Pintus label or something like that. And what it does is it looks at the context of the object that it's labeling or the property it's labeling. And if that's a non-nullable property, it adds a red asterisk to the label that gets displayed. And if it's non-required or nullable, then it takes the asterisk away. So my developers, when they're building out these pages, ASP-Pintus label, and it'll show the red asterisk or not based on the model. They don't have to remember to go in and add asterisks and remove asterisks, right? So that's just another example of a tag helper. All right, view components. What is a view component? In framework, we had this concept of child actions and partial views. And a child action was an action method that could not be called from an endpoint. We have view components, which marries these together. And why would you use a view component? Well, the layout page, as I showed you, doesn't have any code behind. And so if I wanted to reach out to the database and get something like a menu, right? Am I still running? I'm still running. So here, this menu is dynamically built based on all of the makes that are in the database. So I add a new make, automatically shows up on the menu, right? Not a complex thing. But because the layout, the menu's in the layout, and there's no access to the database, I'd have to do some JavaScript to make an AJAX call, or every single page I'd have to have, a section that shows the data. It just gets crunchy. So how do we do it with a view component? View components they're the bomb. I mean, they're just awesome. So let's look at the back-end code for that. We're in the web. We have our view components, and we have our menu view component, and we inherit from view component, and we invoke it. And we are going to get the list of makes, and we're going to turn a view. The menu view, can I navigate to there? I can. The menu view takes this list of makes, and it builds a menu, right? And this is Bootstrap, right? Drop down menu, drop down item, right? There's my tag helper for anchors, right? No area, there's a page, there's a route. This is the all option. And then this one says, oh, for each make, cars index, item ID is the make, and make name. So as I navigate through this site, I go back to inventory all or inventory Pinto, it's going to show the Pintos. Menus, we use this a lot, especially if the menus have to be dynamically altered based on user permissions that are in the database. Right, so I'm reaching out to the database to say, oh wait, I don't want to hide it in HTML, because then somebody can hit F12 and say, oh look, if I just type this URL in, I might get to the menu. It's not even there, right? And we have other security in place also. Shopping cart. You got some e-commerce thing and you want to have a shopping cart on every page. So you put it in your layout as a shopping cart, right? And so it's always going to be there because it calls the database by itself, right? It's just a chunk on the layout. And the way you add these things into the layout If I go back to my menu partial, I go, oh, look, there's my view component menu, right? So all that code is right there, right? It's a tag helper. It's a view component being executed as a tag helper, which means it's server-side code. So what it's going to do is it's going to create the HTML it needs to, and it's going to put it right in there. So any of the types of these, you want to have a progress wizard or things like that. It's just a super powerful construct. Yes. So the comment is this seems weaker than user controls. It's not that you're doing it wrong. Um, I think you've been stuck in web forms for too long. Um, sorry, it's me being snarky. So user controls don't have access to the database. Well, no, you can. You can write an AJAX method to call into it. You can do all kinds of things like that. But a user control itself is a UI partition. It's a partial view. All user controls are partial. Well, okay, no web forms, user controls. There is a server side component. Well, okay, let me just word it this way. Web forms is never going to be supported in .NET Core. And I personally hate user controls. But the reason I hate them is because I've been burned so badly by people thinking that if one control is good, then 100 controls are great. And I'll have pages that have controls built on controls, built on controls, built on controls. This is very, very clean. We're still looking, yeah, we're still looking at the right thing, kind of. This is very clean, right? It is encapsulated, right? Separation of concerns. I just have this little piece of UI and I need to run some server-side code to build it, and then I can plop it anywhere. So conceptually, that's kind of the same as a user control, right? It's running server side. That's what user control is doing anyway. It's running the server-side thing and then coming out. I guess it depends on your definition of weaker. I think this is much cleaner and much more portable. Can it do everything a user control could do? No, but sometimes, too much power brings too much evil. Okay. So the naming convention for these well, first of all, I can just do F12 because I have ReSharper. And I think Visual Studio does the same thing. But the naming convention for a view component, the C# file, is whatever you want component or view component. And then like a controller or a page model, it drops off the word view component, right? And then you take the name of your view component and you lower kebab case it. So let's say this is my menu view component, is the name of C# class. The way it would be named, kind of like my tag helpers, would be lowercase my dash lowercase m menu, right? And it's lower kebab casing because everything's lowercase and there's a dash between each word to make it look like a shish kebab. The convention, no requirement. The convention is the C# file gets in a folder called view components. That's the convention we use. The views itself, there's very strict rules as to where they exist. And I've got them documented in the slides, but essentially it's got to be under pages, either in the same folder, cars, or in shared component menu view. How many of you are using Library Manager? Anyone? Okay. This started off as a Mads who gave the keynote yesterday. This started off as a Mads add-in. It became part of the product. So right click, add, client-side library, right here. The way Library Manager works is you can have a file called libman.json or libmon, however you want to pronounce it, and it's formatted like this. You have a version, you have a default provider, it uses CDN.js, unpackaged, you can use the file system, a number of things. You say, where do I want all my files to go? The default destination. And then here's my libraries. I want jQuery to be in www.root lib jQuery. And it will go here under www.root lib jQuery. So all of my dependencies are here in the lib folder. Let me delete them. Oop. Oh, I can't because you're being used somewhere. It does that to me every now and then. Can I delete that one? Yep. Okay. So Bootstrap's gone. But Bootstrap is here. And I want it to go there. And the really nice thing about this is here's the version. And I only want these files from Bootstrap. I have a lot of gray hair. I remember days where if I wanted jQuery in my project, I had to go to jQuery.org. I had to download the zip. I had to copy the zip into my file and then figure out which files I wanted. So let me right click, restore client side libraries. Bootstrap comes right back. You do get some IntelliSense help. You can pick all files. You can do a number of things. So here's why this is so awesome, right? Because I've got it turned on to restore on build. So every so often, maybe once a month, I go through all of our libmon files and I look at the versions. And I go out to CDNJS and I'm also looking for vulnerabilities, right? And so if I want to update a file in any one of our projects, I go here and say Twitter Bootstrap. Is IntelliSense going to work for me here? It is, right? Let's say 539 existed. I updated 539. I save this file, check it in. Next time you pull down the project or do a get, you get the new libmon. Next time you build, you have 539. Okay, bundling and minification. So bundling is important, minification is important. There's some interesting things going on with the Microsoft templates. They've added some capabilities out of the box to do some gzip compression on your static resources, right? Your JavaScript files and your CSS. It doesn't do bundling, doesn't do minification, but it does add some compression. I prefer to use another MADS tool called Web Optimizer. Web Optimizer, you just download it, you add it in your project. And what Web Optimizer allows you to do is say, hey, I want to minify all CSS files. I want to minify that JS file. I want to build a bundle of these other files. And I only want to do it when I am in production or staging. So the way Web Optimizer works, it's a runtime minification and bundling tool. So I run the app, it then does its thing, and then adds that to a cache. It does the same cache busting as the ASP-append- version, where all of these files get the $v equals an MD5 hash after it, but they're cached, they're not on disk. And so every time they refresh the page, every time you run the app, it's going to, like you run it a lot, but typically in the web, in the real world, it's just running and now it's cached. You go make a change, it knows that the cache has changed, it's going to regenerate the cache. So instead of reading this minified file off of disk with every request, it's cached on the server. So it's a lot more performant. It's called Web Optimizer. Areas are still supported. The need for them has diminished, but let me just tell you what an area is. An area is like a microsite within your application. And so within it, I have areas built into the demo. It's an admin area. I've got a few pages, right? It's maintenance. Microservices kind of try to take the place of it, but I think there's still value in knowing that you can do this. So it's still in the same application, but it's cordoned off a little bit, right? So it's in an area, and then you can lock that down with different security, things like that. And this just allows me to go into a different area of the app. A lot of times it's used for like admin, maintenance screens, things like that. I think now the modern paradigm is you're going to build a microservice, build a whole separate app to do the maintenance. But I think areas are still nice to get that little separation of concerns. There's a section of stuff I didn't cover about the options pattern and DI and things like that. If you came to my talk yesterday, you got that in great detail. It's really fundamental to ASP on a core. It's not fundamental to Razor Pages itself. I hope you enjoyed my session. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate it.